What if Warframe entered the Warhammer 40K universe? The Explorator platform Vigil Unbroken had been hanging above the gas giant Korath's Maw for 11 months before the geometry went wrong. Not the sky, not the void beyond the viewports. The geometry inside the station, in the corridors between Deck 7 and the primary cogitator banks, where Mechanicus acolytes had been logging minor spatial irregularities for 3 weeks. Distances that did not match. Corners that, when approached from the west, seemed to require one step more than the same corner required from the east. Servitor drones rerouting themselves around junctions they had navigated 10,000 times, their path logic grinding against something the station's surveying instruments could not name. Magos Varenthus Dole had reviewed all 47 incident reports personally. She had dismissed 39 of them as cogitator drift. The other 8 she had marked with a single glyph in her personal notation, unknown. She was reviewing the 9th when the platform shook. Not from impact. Not from the gas giant's gravity fluctuations, which she knew intimately, the way a woman knows the breathing of something enormous sleeping beneath her. This was a shiver that ran through the station's superstructure sideways, against the grain of physics, as though the platform had briefly occupied 2 positions simultaneously, and the metal remembered both. Alarms sounded. Her mechadendrites were already interfacing with the sensor array before the klaxons had fully cycled through their first warning pulse, her consciousness spreading into the data space with the practiced ease of a mind that had shed its biological limitations one grafted component at a time. What the sensors returned was not an impact signature, not a warp event, which she had catalogued and cross-referenced against 17 competing taxonomies of Empyrean phenomena. Not an asteroid strike, not a gravity surge, not a catastrophic systems failure. The sensors returned a geometric shape, a wound in space that was not a tear but a fold, something that had pressed 2 points of the materium together with surgical precision and then released them, like a thumb pressed into clay. The shape existed for 4.7 seconds. Then it was gone. What remained, on the deck of Corridor Junction 7 Auric, surrounded by the wreckage of 3 servitor drones that had been cut apart with a precision that left their power cells intact and their locomotion systems cleanly severed at the joint, was a figure. It stood 7 feet tall in a silhouette that was almost human. Almost. The proportions were close enough to suggest a transhuman warrior, an Astartes perhaps, but wrong in ways that mattered. Too fluid in the joints, too still in the torso. The armor it wore was blue-gray and gold, layered in planes that did not correspond to any Mechanicus catalogued suit pattern, and it was covered in shallow cuts and scoring that looked old, accumulated, like damage that had been lived in rather than repaired. Across the faceplate ran a crack, sealed but not healed, and from somewhere behind that sealed crack came a sound that Magos Dole's audio receptors struggled to classify. A low frequency, subsonic and suprasonic simultaneously, not a mechanical noise, not quite a biological one. Grief. She would identify it later, reviewing the audio logs in her private sanctum. The closest analog in her emotional resonance banks was grief. 3 of her security servitors arrived first. They lasted 11 seconds. The figure moved through them in a manner that the station's picked feeds captured, but that her analysis engines refused to render into comprehensible tactical notation. Not fast, precisely. Not enhanced in any way that matched Astartes' combat doctrine or any Xenos pattern she had indexed. The figure moved as though it occupied a slightly different frame of time than everything around it, its blade drawing lines of light that registered on her sensors as energy readings in no known spectrum, neither plasma nor LAS, nor warp generated. The blade itself was extraordinary, long, shaped in the manner of an Eldari weapon but heavier, and when it connected with the servitor chassis, it did not cut so much as it insisted, as though the metal understood it had lost and parted accordingly. The figure did not pursue. When the security response fell, it stopped. It stood in the corridor amid the wreckage, not victorious, not wary. It stood the way a sleepwalker stands, present in body and absent in every other sense that mattered. The picked feed showed it turn its head slowly, reading the space around it, and Dole realized with the particular clarity that came from having replaced her biological fear response with a threat assessment cogitator that the entity had not known it was fighting. It had responded to threats without awareness. The blade had moved, and the figure had moved, and the security servitors had died, and none of it had required the entity's attention. She sealed the blast doors around Junction 7 Auric before her deputy could issue the platform-wide alert. She countermanded the automatic void lock sequence that would have vented that corridor to space. She brought up the entity's sensor profile on her primary display and looked at it for a long time, her memory engrams cycling through the biological habit she had never managed to excise. When confronted with something genuinely new, Verenthas Dole went quiet. Her deputy, Acolyte Brennar Hess, 6 years into his augmentation progression and still carrying enough biological tissue to sweat visibly, said, "Magos, purge authorization." "No," she said. "The security protocol requires override. My authority. Log it." She did not look away from the display. "It is neither Xenos nor warp-touched, Brennar. Look at the energy readings. Look at what the blade does. Cross-reference against every Chaos weapon profile in the Mechanicus catalog." He did. He was quiet for a moment. No match. Against every Xenos weapon profile, no match. Against Archaeotech theoretical models, pre-heresy weapon designs, every experimental Martian schema we have clearance to access, and the 3 we don't. A longer pause. "No match," he said again, more quietly. "It is something new," she said, "and Omnissiah, forgive me, Brennar, I am not going to destroy it." She sent a single communication to the station's head of security, ordering a containment perimeter maintained at 2 corridors remove from the entity's position. She dispatched probe servitors with orders to observe and record, not approach. She poured herself into the sensor data and she studied, and for the first time in 7 years of systematic exploration, Magos Verenthas Dole felt something she had assumed was gone with her amygdala and her orbital cortex. She felt wonder, and beneath it, something she would not name for 2 more days, something that her daughter's face, surfacing unbidden through the memory engrams, seemed to name for her. Recognition. The entity remained in Junction 7 Auric for 9 hours. It did not eat. It did not require atmosphere, based on the oxygen consumption readings, which did not change measurably. It did not interface with the station's systems. It stood or it moved in slow, deliberate patterns that Dole eventually identified as something like pacing, though pacing was too purposeless a word for the systematic way it traversed the space, running its gauntleted hand along the wall at regular intervals, as though reading something in the metal. At hour 6, it knelt. It remained kneeling for 3 hours. The blade was laid across its thighs, not sheathed, not held at the ready, simply present. And then, at hour 9, something changed. Dole noticed it in the sensor data before she saw it on the pict feed. A secondary biosignature had been present since the entity's arrival, faint, nested inside the larger frame signature, like a small animal sheltering inside a larger one's ribcage. For 9 hours it had been dormant, a flat line for brain activity, a chemical profile that matched nothing in any biological catalog she possessed. And then, at the 9th hour, it woke. The change in the figure was immediate and total. It was the difference between a fire that had been burning without fuel, running on something that was not combustion, and a fire given wood. The posture changed. The head came up. The hands, which had rested on the blade with the absolute stillness of something that was not alive in any conventional sense, closed deliberately around the hilt, and from behind the cracked faceplate came a sound that was not the subsonic grief frequency she had been cataloging. A voice. Not spoken aloud through any external vocoder, broadcast through the station's own internal Vox system, somehow, as though the entity had simply decided that the Vox system was available and used it. "Where," said the voice, "is this?" Not a question, not exactly. A statement that demanded an answer. A consciousness that was gathering the world around it with the focused intensity of someone who had woken from something terrible and was doing the rapid calculus of damage assessment, threat appraisal, resource inventory. The voice itself was young, too young for what the posture communicated, too young for the weight of the silence that followed it. Verinthas Dole opened the Vox channel. "You are aboard the Mechanicus Explorator platform Vigil Unbroken," she said, in the even, measured cadence she had cultivated over 3 decades of first contact protocols. "Above the gas giant designated Korath's Maw. In the region of space your likely navigational systems would have no reference for. It is called the Coronus Expanse. This is the Imperium of Man." She paused. "You are not where you were." A silence. Long enough that she thought the entity had retreated back into its 9-hour stillness. Then, "I know that." Another pause. "I know that. I meant where in here. What deck?" She blinked her optical receptors, which was a habit she had never lost, a ghost of biological processing. "Junction 7 Auric. Deck 7. Why?" "Because whatever you open to study me is 2 levels down, and if it gets any larger, you're going to lose the station." The silence this time was hers. Dole pulled her sensor display back to the macro level, the platform-wide survey readout she had been neglecting in favor of the entity's immediate vicinity, and she saw it. Deck 5, in the section where her junior acolytes had been running comparative analysis on the geometric irregularities, attempting to source them, to map them, believing the readings were instrumental error. Not instrumental error, the fold-wound, the geometric impossibility that had delivered the entity, had not closed cleanly. It had closed at its primary aperture and opened a secondary bleed, smaller, irregular, pulsing with a rhythm that matched nothing she had indexed, and matched the entity's biosignature in ways that made her think of a wound, tracking back to the weapon that had made it. "How do you know this?" she said. "Because I can feel it," the voice said, and there was something in those 4 words that was not anger, not fear, not any single emotion she could taxonomize. All of them, simultaneously, and beneath them, something ancient and exhausted. "It's the void. I speak void. And whatever you've done down there, something followed me through, and it's using the bleed to get here." That was when Verinthas Dole made the second catastrophic decision of her career. The first had been not destroying the entity. The second was saying, "Then we address the bleed together. I require information, and you require assistance. I believe we can negotiate." She paused. "What are you?" The voice was quiet for a moment. When it answered, the word was precise, carrying the weight of something that had been true for longer than she could imagine. Ateno. She did not know the word. She cross-referenced every Xenos catalog, every heretical text, every pre-heresy designation in her memory banks. Nothing returned. Truly new then. Truly something the galaxy had not catalogued. The entity began to move, and the pict feeds tracked it descending toward Deck 5, blade in hand, and Verinthas Dole watched a weapon that grieved go to work. The acolytes on Deck 5 had named the bleed the aperture, in the way that Mechanicus personnel always named things they did not understand, as though nomenclature was the first step toward ownership. They had erected sensor arrays around it, 16 of them, positioned at the vertices of a measurement lattice they had designed to quantify the irregularities' geometry. The arrays were still operational, the acolytes were not. Dole found them at their stations, alive, unharmed, but unresponsive. Their eyes open, their vital signs nominal, their minds somewhere else entirely. The aperture measured 4 meters across. It did not look like anything. That was the most disturbing aspect. A warp breach looked like something. It burned with unreal light. It smelled of copper and madness. It announced itself in the language of violation. The aperture looked like nothing, a space where the air forgot to be air, where the light forgot to fall in straight lines, where the deck plating simply became ambiguous about whether it existed at this coordinate or slightly elsewhere. Looking at it directly induced not terror but a profound blankness, as though the brain, confronted with something that did not fit any of its categorical systems, elected to not file the experience at all. The Tenno arrived 4 minutes before the thing that followed them did. The aperture pulsed, not opened, not split, not tore, pulsed, like a heartbeat, and from the pulse came a pressure. a wave of something that was not psychic force in any sense that the station's warp-dampening arrays responded to. They remained quiescent, their Auspex systems finding nothing to trigger on. The platform's Geller field held steady and silent, detecting no Empyrean presence. What the pressure felt like, to the biological tissue remaining in the crew's bodies, was the sensation of being watched. Not by eyes, by a process. Something that had located them the way an equation locates its solution, not through sensation but through logic, following the necessary chain from variable to outcome. The thing that came through was not large. That was the second thing that surprised her. Dole had expected something commensurate with the category of threat the Tenno's warning had implied. Something massive, something that announced itself in the physical vocabulary of power. The entity that emerged from the aperture was roughly humanoid, roughly 2 meters, and made entirely of a material that her sensors alternately classified as organic polymer, coherent light, and something that had no classification at all. It was silver-white and geometric in the way that living things are not geometric, its joints moving on axes that no biological articulation supported. Its face, if face was the right word, a smooth ovoid that suggested a face the way a mask suggests the expression beneath it. No mouth, no eyes in any conventional sense, a head that perceived in ways she could not instrument. It was looking at the Tenno. Not at her, not at the station. At the Tenno specifically, with the fixed attention of a predator that has tracked prey across a very long distance and does not intend to be distracted now that it has arrived. "Sentient," said the Tenno's voice, flat through the vox. No emotion in the word, the name of a category. The recognition of something so fundamental that emotional response had been stripped away by familiarity. This was not the first time they had spoken this word over a creature like this one. The sentient made no sound, it moved. The space between them closed in a fraction of a second. The sentient was fast in the way that physics allows, and then a little beyond. Its movement occupying the gap between perception and reaction, and the blow it delivered to the Warframe's chest carried the force of a calculation rather than a muscle, precise, targeted, applying pressure at a specific structural point in the armor with the clinical efficiency of an entity that had mapped the weakness in the 3 seconds since it arrived. The Umbra went back 3 meters, hit the bulkhead, the metal caved. Then it was back upright. The blade was moving. What followed was not a duel in any human sense of the word. It was an argument conducted in the language of physics, 2 forms of impossible meeting in a space that was barely adequate for either of them. The sentient adapted. This was the horror at the center of what a sentient was, the thing that made them the extinction nightmare of the civilization that had made them. Every ability shown, every power deployed, became armor against the next instance of that ability. The Tenno threw radial force, void light blooming in golden sheets from the Warframe's palms, and the first wave staggered the sentient, drove it back toward the aperture, scarred its geometric surface with burn marks that smoked with a golden light that had no business being in this part of the universe. The second wave hit a surface that had already learned. The sentient absorbed it, converted it, turned it back. The Umbra took the reflected void burst full in the chest and went down on one knee. Dole was watching all of this through the pict feeds and the sensor arrays simultaneously, processing the combat data with one partition of her mind, while another partition was doing something she could not fully account for, something that felt uncomfortably like prayer, though she had replaced her limbic system's fear response 12 years ago, and prayer had nothing to do with fear. She was watching the Warframe. Not the whole Warframe, the cracks. The crack in the faceplate that she had noted upon the entity's arrival, hairline, structural, the kind of damage that was old and had been old for a long time. The crack was glowing, not with weaponized void light, differently, softly, the way an ember glows when air reaches it. The Tenno was thinking. She could not have explained how she knew this. There were no visible indicators. The Warframe was momentarily down, and the sentient was approaching with the measured pace of something that had already calculated the outcome. But the glow in the faceplate's crack was not the glow of damage or distress. It was the glow of a mind working against an impossible problem, sorting through everything it had, and everything it had seen, and arriving at something. The Tenno stood. The blade did not come up. The hands opened instead, gauntleted palms out, and Dole recognized the geometry of it. Not a surrender posture, not a guard posture, the posture of someone who intended to catch something. The sentient hit them at full velocity, closing the distance and driving both forms into the opposite bulkhead, with force enough to buckle the deck plating beneath them and crack the superstructure seam along the corridor ceiling. The impact was catastrophic in the localized sense. Dole lost 3 sensor arrays. The Vox system crackled and dropped for 6 seconds. When it returned, the sentient was still. The Umbra's arms were around it, not in a grip of strength, in a grip of void. Golden light, not the weaponized burst that the sentient had already adapted to, something different, something quieter, radiated from every point of contact between them and into the sentient's geometric form, not as force but as resonance. Like a tuning fork placed against a bell, the sentient's silver-white surface flickered. Destabilized, the geometric precision of its joints began to lose definition at the edges, the clean angles blurring into something less certain. "You remember what you were," the Tenno said, quietly. "Not through the Vox this time. Directly into the space between them. Before they made you into this. Before the war made you into this." The sentient shuddered, a full-body oscillation that her sensors read as simultaneous structural destabilization and massive energy release. The aperture behind them pulsed hard, once, and the void bleed shrank, contracted, became smaller with each shudder of the entity in the Tenno's grip. "I know," said the Tenno, "I know what that is like." The sentient came apart, not violently, the way ice comes apart in warm water, losing definition gradually, becoming something that had always been distributed, returning to a distribution rather than a concentration. The geometric form disaggregated into light, and that light was absorbed by the aperture as it closed, the wound folding shut around the energy like a mouth swallowing, and then there was only the corridor, the buckled deck plating, the broken arrays, the comatose acolytes who were already beginning to blink and stir, and the Warframe standing in the center of all of it, blade still sheathed, both hands still open. The crack in the faceplate was still glowing, dimmer now, but still. Dole spent 40 seconds simply processing what she had witnessed. Then she opened the Vox. "The entity that followed you," she said. "You dissolved it, not destroyed, dissolved." "Yes," said the Tenno. "It adapted to your abilities. You changed your abilities." "Yes." "What did you use at the end? The resonance. What was that?" A pause that was longer than the question required, as though the answer needed to be selected carefully from several available answers, and the selection mattered. "It was a reminder," the Tenno said at last. "Sentients were made. They didn't choose what they became. Neither did I. That's sometimes enough to matter." She wanted to ask more. The part of her that was still Verenthus Dole, not the Magos, not the machine, the part that dreamed her daughter's face and had saved all 47 incident reports with careful notation, wanted to ask 100 more questions. The part of her that was the Magos wanted to begin measurements immediately. She overruled both of them in favor of immediate practicality. "You need to come to my sanctum," she said. "We have many things to discuss and very little time before the Inquisition learns you are here." She had slightly less time than she estimated. 14 hours, not the 24 she had been calculating on. Inquisitorial Vox channels were monitoring everything that touched the Coronis expanse with the paranoid efficiency they had cultivated over 10,000 years of being the Imperium's first line of defense against anything that did not fit the established categories. The Vigil Unbroken's sensor ghost, the anomalous energy readings, the spatial irregularity, the subsequent loss of the Deck 5 Acolyte's consciousness for 37 minutes, all of it had pinged something in the automated surveillance network that she should have anticipated and had not. The communication arrived 14 hours after the sentient dissolved. A vessel had translated in-system 18 hours prior, running silent, and she had not flagged it because she had been focused elsewhere. The hailing signature identified it as the Emperor's Covenant, an inquisitorial black ship running under the authority of Inquisitor Vel Ranox of the Ordo Xenos, and the message was 3 sentences. We are aware of the anomaly. We are aware of the entity. Prepare for boarding. Dole looked at the 3 sentences for a long moment. Then she looked at the door to her sanctum, where the Tenno was waiting, and she did the mathematics of time and jurisdiction and political force with the part of her mind that was still very much human, still the girl from Vostroya who had survived 11 years of processing plants before a Mechanicus talent scout had seen the numbers she could hold in her head without a cogitator. She sent a return message. Of course, Inquisitor, please be advised that the entity is cooperative, non-hostile, and of extreme archaeotech significance. I recommend an assessment period before any punitive action, the Omnissiah's light. Then she went to the sanctum and told the Tenno that their time had shortened considerably. The Tenno sat on the floor of her sanctum with the Warframe's legs crossed and the blade laid across them, a posture she recognized from the pict feeds of the entity's first 9 hours. Not meditation, something older than meditation. A posture of waiting that had been learned from waiting through things that had no right answer and no good outcome. The posture of someone who had made their peace with the costs and was simply waiting for the bill to arrive. She told them about the Imperium in 20 minutes, hitting the structural facts with the precision of a Magos who understood that any intelligent entity could extrapolate the implications from sufficient data points. The Emperor, the heresy, the 41 centuries that had passed since, the 10,000 years of unrelenting war on every front, the factions, the politics, the cost of existing as something the Inquisition could not categorize. She told them all of it, and the Tenno listened without interrupting, and when she finished there was a silence that she recognized, having experienced it herself at several turning points in her career, as the silence of a mind confronting a scale of suffering that it did not have adequate models for. 10,000 years, the Tenno said at last. Yes. Continuous war, that entire time, with brief interruptions that served primarily to reposition for the next war. Yes. Another silence. In my system, the Tenno said carefully, the war I fight, the Orokin, were consumed from within. The infested, the sentience, everything, cost everything, every generation. But we had intervals, we had the reservoir, there was something like sleep between the worst of it. A pause. There is nothing like that here. No, she said, there is not. The Tenno looked at their hands. She noticed this, the looking at the hands, as though the gloves of the Warframe were somehow translucent, and what lay beneath was worth examining. And the people, they said, the ordinary people, the ones who aren't Astartes or Inquisitors or Mechanicus, what do they have? She thought about this with the kind of honesty that had cost her a great deal over the years, and had never once felt optional. Hope that the Imperium holds, work that keeps them from thinking too much about the war, the promise that if they die in service, their sacrifice is recorded somewhere. She paused. Faith. Many of them have faith. In the Emperor, yes. Is he alive? She said. After a fashion. He has not spoken for 10,000 years. He sustains the Astronomicon from the Golden Throne. He is the Imperium's psychic anchor, its navigation beacon, its sacred center, and he has not moved or spoken since the heresy. What you would categorize him as, from what I understand of your universe's terminology, I cannot say. The Tenno said nothing for a long time. She watched the glow in the faceplate's crack cycle slowly, dim and bright, dim and bright. A rhythm she was beginning to interpret as equivalent to breathing. Or thinking. Perhaps, for this entity, the two were the same. I came from the old war, the Tenno said finally. I was a child. Children were put in the Warframes, and the Warframes made us something other than children, and the war needed us to be that other thing, and so we became it. And for a long time I thought the cost was only mine. They stopped, started again. The dissociation, the splitting. There's a technical name for it in the Zariman's records. We called it transference. Using the frame as a shell, being inside, but not being the body. It kept us alive. It kept the war alive. A pause. I thought that was a solution specific to us, to what was done to us. She understood, then, what the Tenno was seeing in the Imperium of Man, not a foreign civilization, a mirror. The Astartes, she said quietly, the process of creating a space marine, what it requires. They don't remember being children, the Tenno said, not as a question. They are trained to regard their pre-service existence as a previous self that is gone, not dissociated, replaced. That's not better, the Tenno said. That's the same thing with different words. The Inquisitorial boarding shuttle docked at Dock 4 3 hours later. Inquisitor Vel Ranox came aboard with 12 stormtroopers in carapace armor and a personal retinue of 4 acolytes who moved with the practiced discretion of people who had learned to be invisible and very rarely were. He was a compact man in his middle years, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, wearing the rosette of the Ordo Xenos with the particular care of someone who had earned it through events he did not discuss at dinner. Verenthas Dole met him at the dock with her deputy and 2 senior acolytes, and she performed the ritual of Mechanicus, greeting with the exact degree of formality that indicated she respected his authority and was not remotely intimidated by it. "Magos Dole," he said, "take me to it. The entity is in my sanctum. Before we proceed, Inquisitor, I must advise you of several complicating factors in the standard Xenos Purge framework. I'm familiar with complicating factors. They don't typically revise the framework. This one may," she said, and led him down the corridor. She told him everything on the way, because she had learned that Inquisitors performed best when given full information rather than partial information, and that the instinct to withhold from them, however understandable, typically resulted in outcomes measurably worse than the ones you were trying to prevent. She told him about the sentient, about the aperture and its closure, about the cooperative posture the Tenno had maintained since full consciousness. She told him about the energy readings and the weapon spectrum that matched no known catalog. Ranox listened without expression. He was very good at that. When she finished, he said, "You've been holding conversations with an undocumented Xenos entity for 14 hours, rather than voxing me immediately." "Yes. The fact that it is not warp-touched does not make it sanctioned. The fact that it assisted with the containment of a secondary threat does not make it sanctioned. I am aware. The fact that you find it interesting, Magos, does not make it sanctioned. Inquisitor," she said, "nothing that advances the Omnissiah's understanding of the universe's fundamental mechanisms is sanctioned ahead of time. That is the nature of advancement. I am prepared to receive your ruling. I am asking for the opportunity to make the case for assessment before execution." He studied her for 3 seconds with the kind of attention that took in everything and weighed it all simultaneously. 48 hours, he said at last, after which I make my own determination. They reached the sanctum. He entered. The Tenno stood, which she thought was a significant gesture, the universal signal of acknowledgement between intelligent parties that required no translation. Ranox looked at the Warframe for a long moment, his hand not on his weapon but near it, the posture of someone managing the gap between professional discipline and biological alarm. "You understand Gothic," he said. "I can," the Tenno said. "I'm still adapting to the dialect." "What are you?" The Tenno considered the question with the deliberateness she was learning to read as a characteristic response. "A warrior," they said, "who woke up somewhere unexpected. Are you loyal to any authority I would recognize?" "No," the Tenno said, not defiant, simply honest. "The authority I was loyal to is gone. The system I serve now, I serve by choice. It is my system, not a government, not a hierarchy. There is no one to swear loyalty to, except what I judge to be right." Ranox's expression, she noted, did not change. This was, she reflected, either because he found the answer acceptable, or because he found it exactly as dangerous as he expected, and had already decided what to do about it. With Inquisitors, the 2 responses were difficult to distinguish. "We will," he said, "continue this conversation." It was during that conversation's 2nd hour, in the formal conference chamber 2 decks above, that Quillin Varesh arrived. There was no boarding alert, no dock signal, no sensor warning, The conference chamber's door, which had been sealed and guarded, opened, and the Harlequin Shadowseer stepped through it with the perfect unhurried grace of someone who had confirmed the door's sealedness and considered it a suggestion rather than a fact. She wore the diamond-patterned motley of her troop in colors that should not have worked together and somehow generated a harmony that was almost mathematical, and her mask was white with a painted tear beneath the left eye that was not symmetrical with the painted smile beneath the right, and the total effect was of a person composed entirely of contradictions that had somehow achieved equilibrium. Rannox had his weapon drawn before she had fully entered the room. The stormtroopers had weapons drawn a quarter second later. The Tenno's hand moved to the blade and stopped there without drawing, which Dole thought was possibly the most sophisticated read of the room she had seen in her career. Quillen Varesh raised both hands, not in surrender, in the gesture of a person who finds weapons pointed at them genuinely amusing, and said, "Please, not the Tenno. You will waste the bullet, Inquisitor, and your expression suggests you are already running short on goodwill to waste." Her Gothic was impeccable and approximately 600 years out of date in its formal construction. Rannox did not lower his weapon. "You have 30 seconds to explain your presence on this station before I make a very practical decision." "I have been on this station for 4 days," said the Harlequin. "You arrived 11 months ago, Margos. I was here first." She turned to the Tenno, ignoring the guns with serene indifference. "I have been waiting for you specifically. Not for you, exactly. For whoever was going to come through the geometric wound that my colleagues have been predicting for 600 years. The prediction was specific about the nature of the arrival, not about which Tenno. We have been debating the details among ourselves. I believed it would be someone carrying grief. I was correct." She tilted her head. "You are Umbra." "Yes," the Tenno said. "The frame that remembered," she said. "Interesting. We expected a blank slate. The universe is never what the prediction says, only what the prediction implies." She looked at Dole. "Your experiment with the geometric wound was inevitable. You were always going to poke at it. The question was whether the poking would be careful or catastrophic. It was, in the assessment of this room, somewhere between." She sat down in an empty chair with the casual ownership of someone who had been invited rather than infiltrated. "Shall we discuss what the void wound actually means? I have been waiting some time to discuss it with someone who speaks void." The Inquisitor said, "Why should I not have you executed immediately?" "Because I came here to prevent a disaster," said Quillen Varesh, "and also because I am already dead in every future in which you do that, which means you make a different choice. I have read this story to the end, Inquisitor. I know which decisions are the ones that survive contact with the final page." She folded her hands in her lap. "You make the practical choice." Rannox looked at her for a very long time. Then, with the particular manner of a man accepting a tactical situation he had not chosen, he sat down. What the Shadowseer told them reshaped the room's understanding of everything that had occurred so far, and it was this. The Eldari had not always called the strange geometry beyond the warp the void. They had older names for it, from the era before the webway, from the craftwork of Isha's first children who had understood the universe's structure in ways that had been lost with them. The oldest name translated imperfectly as the Between, and the Between was not a dimension in the sense that the warp was a dimension. It was the seam, the place where the materium and the empyrean were sutured together, and the suture was not always clean. In certain places, under certain conditions, the suture had been stretched or compressed, and in those places, the Between was accessible. Not traversable, not livable, but reachable, in the way that the inside of a wall is reachable if you know exactly where to press. The Tenno's void, she explained, was not analogous to the warp. It was analogous to the Between. The geometric wound through which they had arrived was not a warp tear. It was a between-fold, and the Eldari prophecy, 600 years old and much debated in the chambers of the Farseers, said that when a between-fold opened in the Coronis expanse, what came through would be the first entity since the Eldari's founding age to be native to the Between, rather than merely capable of touching it. "Not a weapon," she said, "not an anomaly. A voice that speaks the language the universe uses to speak to itself. That is what a Tenno is, structurally, at the level that matters, and that is why the sentient followed you. It felt a native speaking. It came to the source. The Tenno was very still. You're saying the void is universal. I am saying, Quillin Varesh replied, that your void, and our between, and what your universe's physicists call the void, are all the same suture, seen from different sides. You simply happen to be made of thread. The silence that followed was the silence of a room in which the category of the possible had just been significantly expanded, and no one was immediately certain whether that was good or catastrophic. Rannoch said, "This changes nothing about the threat assessment." "It changes everything about it," Dole said simultaneously. They looked at each other. "It means," Dole said carefully, "that the Tenno's abilities are not warp-derived, that the standard Psyker abomination framework does not apply, that the risk profile of the entity's presence is categorically different from anything in the Ordo Xenos threat catalog. Or," said Rannox, "it means that the threat is simply new rather than familiar, and that newness is not evidence of safety. Something outside the established categories of danger is not therefore safe. It is simply uncategorized." "Inquisitor," the Tenno said, and both of them looked at the Warframe. "I am not asking for your protection. I am not asking for your authorization. I am telling you what I am, because the woman who chose to study, rather than destroy me, made a decision that cost her something, and that cost deserves honesty." A pause. "I am not your psyker. I am not your weapon. I am not your abomination. I am a person who survived something terrible by learning to be more than one thing at once, and I arrived here, and your universe is full of people doing exactly that, surviving terrible things by becoming something they weren't before the war required it. I don't need you to decide what I am. I need you to let me help." Another silence. This one had a different texture, the texture of a decision being made. Rannox put his weapon away. It was not a gesture of acceptance. It was a gesture of assessment, the deliberate movement of a man who had made 10,000 judgment calls in the field and knew when he was at the edge of the data and had to trust the quality of his own reading. "The void bleed," he said. "The aperture, is it fully closed?" "Yes," the Tenno said. "You're certain?" "I would know. It is closed." The sentient was the only follower. The only one that came through. There may be more on the other side of the seam. "The void space I crossed to get here was not empty." A pause. "But the wound is closed. Whatever I was being tracked through is closed." Rannox stood. He looked at Dole. "Your 48 hours begin now. I want sensor logs of everything that occurred on Deck 5. Every reading. Every frame of picked feed. I want access to your resonance data from the Tenno's engagement with the sentient, the full spectrum." He turned to the Tenno. "You will agree to sensor monitoring, non-invasive. You will not access the station's systems without the Magos's explicit authorization. You will remain on this platform." "Yes," the Tenno said. "If you are what the Eldari claims," he said, "the implications for the Imperium are significant enough that I cannot unilaterally make the call. This goes up the chain, and the chain is not gentle." "I know," said the Tenno. "I've dealt with institutional chains before. I know what they look like from inside and outside." It was Quillin Varesh, from her chair, who said what no one else had said. "The question is not what the Inquisitor decides. The question is, what happens when the second fold opens? Because the first was a coincidence, the second will be an invitation." Everyone in the room looked at her. She looked at the Tenno. "Your presence here is a tuning fork placed against the universe's seam. The resonance propagates. It does not stop at one fold. The suture rings." She paused. "You closed one wound. How many sentients do you think sensed the ringing before the wound sealed?" The crack in the Umbra's faceplate pulsed once with golden light. "More than one," the Tenno said. "Considerably more than one," the Shadow Seer agreed, with the pleasant tone of someone confirming an answer they had known for several centuries. The prophecy was specific about the first arrival being a voice. It was silent on the subject of the chorus that follows. The 48 hours that followed were the most compressed and improbable intellectual exchange in Magos Dole's career, which had itself contained several exchanges that she would not have predicted from any prior dataset. She worked in shifts of 6 hours on, 2 hours of minimal maintenance, back to 6 hours, pushing her organic components to their functional limits and finding those limits marginally wider than she had estimated. The Tenno worked with her, speaking in careful detail about void mechanics, about the nature of the between as they experienced it, about the resonance frequencies that different materials and biological structures exhibited under void proximity. The data was extraordinary, not because it confirmed the Mechanicus's existing models, but because it demolished them in the most productive possible way, the way that false assumptions collapse when a primary datum contradicts them, and the collapse reveals the shape of a truer model beneath. She scrapped 17 years of theoretical work in the first 8 hours and found she was not grieving it. The new shape was more beautiful than the old one. That was the signal she trusted most, having learned from decades of work that the truest model of any phenomenon was the one that struck you when you finally saw it as inevitable. She also talked to the Tenno, not only about the void. This was the part she had not planned for, the conversations that happened in the margins of the data exchange, when one of them needed a pause and the other filled it, and the fill became something she had not expected. She told the Tenno about her daughter. She had not told anyone about her daughter in 9 years, since the augmentation sequence that had removed her larynx and replaced it with a vox emitter had coincidentally seemed to remove the ability to speak of personal things. But the Tenno listened in the way that certain people listen, with a quality of attention that was not sympathy and not pity, and was not waiting for you to finish so they could speak, but was simply, completely, receiving, and she found that she was speaking. Her daughter's name had been Mira. She had died on Vostroya 11 years ago, in an Orc raid that the Planetary Defense Force had repelled at significant cost. Mira had been a Vox operator in the PDF. She had been 23. Dole had been in the Mechanicus for 15 years by then, already mostly machine, and the machine had helped her survive the grief in ways that the grief counselors in the Mechanicus chaplaincy, when she had briefly consulted them, had told her she should be grateful for. The machine helped you not feel things too much. They said this as if it were a recommendation. You kept the memory engrams, the Tenno said. I have replaced everything except them, she confirmed. I am not certain whether it is weakness or an unwillingness to become something that does not contain her. That is not weakness, the Tenno said, with a certainty that was quiet and absolute. The thing that I was split from, the me that lived in the Warframe's body while I was in the void, the me that is this frame. When it remembered, when the Umbra remembered, it was because someone tried to take the memory away. And the frame burned rather than forget. A pause. Memory is not weakness. Memory is the thing that knows what was worth protecting in the first place. She processed this for a long moment. She had reduced her emotional response systems to minimum functional parameters years ago. She was aware that something was occurring in the residual organic tissue around her memory engrams that the remaining biological monitoring equipment classified as mild elevating of cortisol and serotonin analogues. She chose not to label it further than that. It was at hour 36 of the 48 that Quillin Varesh came to find her in the data lab, alone, with the Tenno's monitoring feeds running beside her, and the sensor data from Deck 5 arranged in a 3-dimensional lattice above her primary workspace. The second fold will open in 11 hours, the Shadow Seer said, without preamble. Dole looked at her. You have predicted the exact timing. I have read the skein forward from the first fold's closure. The resonance propagates at a predictable rate. The between seam around this platform has been ringing since the sentient arrived. There are resonant harmonics building in the geometric substructure of local space. Your instruments would detect them if you knew what to look for. She paused. I am telling you what to look for. Dole redirected 3 sensor arrays to the geometric monitoring suite she had been developing, based on the Tenno's description of void frequencies, and she looked at the readouts for 6 seconds, and she said, very quietly, "Oh." The harmonics were visible once you knew the shape of them. Clear as a bell being struck in an empty room, building, regular. 11 hours was optimistic, she recalculated. 9 hours, she said, possibly 8. The skein is not always precise at this scale, the Shadow Seer agreed. I recommend waking the Inquisitor. He will want to seal the platform. He will want many things. What he will do is listen to the Tenno, because the Tenno is the only entity present who has closed one of these wounds from the inside, and he is pragmatic enough to know that the theoretical option of purging the Tenno ends his viable response list at 1 entry. She sat down across from Dole. You should also tell the Magos something else. The sentients are not random. The one that came through was a scout. What follows will not be a scout. Dole looked at her. What will it be? Larger, the Shadow Seer said simply, and much older. She woke the Inquisitor. She woke the Tenno. She brought them both to the data lab and showed them the harmonics and stated the timeline without commentary, letting the data speak in the language of certainty that she had always trusted, more than any word she could place around it. Rannox looked at the readings for a long time without speaking. The Tenno looked at them, and then looked away, at the wall, with the particular stillness of someone measuring something against internal data. It will not fit through a fold the size of the first one, the Tenno said. Whatever is coming, it's been carrying size for a long time. It will need a larger opening. Can you prevent the fold from opening? Rannox asked. No, I can close it after, maybe, if I have enough. A pause. I don't have my arsenal. I don't have my orbiter. I don't have Ordis, who would at least be telling me my plan was inadvisable with enormous passive aggression right now. There was something in the voice, a thread of something that was not quite humor but that occupied the space where humor would be, in a person who had the energy for it. It lasted half a second, then it was gone. What I have is the frame, and the void, and the between, and whatever I learned from closing the first one, it will have to be enough. What do you need from us? Dole said. Give me space. Literally. Clear the decks around wherever the fold opens. If the sentient that comes through is what I think it is, it will make the first one look like a probe servitor, and I can't protect people while fighting it. Deck 5 again, Rannox said. The harmonics are building strongest in Deck 9, Dole said, reading her array. The superstructure there is less reinforced. The fold will take the path of least geometric resistance. Clear Deck 9, Rannox said, looking at his stormtroopers. Now. Everyone off that deck. Full cordon at the access points. Nothing comes through the cordon except on my direct order. The next 8 hours had the particular quality of time that moves at 2 speeds simultaneously. In the command center, running on compressed urgency. In the corridors being evacuated, in the slow march of Mechanicus personnel and servitors and the 100 other bodies that populated a platform of this size, on a human timescale that could not be compressed, that moved at the pace of legs and concerns and the physical weight of equipment that needed to be relocated. Dole managed both timescales simultaneously, her consciousness split between the macro sensor readout and the operational logistics with the practiced ease of a mind that had been designed to hold multiple streams. She found herself watching the Tenno through the monitoring feeds as they prepared on Deck 9 alone, sitting in the center of the empty deck in the Warframe's crossed leg posture, the crack in the faceplate glowing steadily now, not pulsing, burning, continuous. The golden light of someone who was not meditating but maintaining, holding a state of readiness that required constant effort and would not allow the break of a resting state. She thought about what they had said. Memory is not weakness. Memory is the thing that knows what was worth protecting in the first place. She thought about Mira. She thought about the Umbra, which had refused to forget, which had burned rather than forget, which had been a weapon that remembered it was a person, and had never reconciled those two things into something that stopped hurting. She thought about the Imperium, 10,000 years of fighting a war that could not be won only survived, with weapons that were people and people that were weapons, with the living emperor who was more symbol than consciousness now, burning on his throne to keep the lights on for the species he had made, the biggest warframe in the universe, the oldest transference. The fold opened at 7 hours and 43 minutes, not 8, not 9. The harmonics spiked and Dole had 3 seconds of warning before Deck 9 went from an empty compartment to something that was partly Deck 9 and partly the between, and mostly neither, the geometry of the space stretching sideways in the way she was becoming grimly familiar with, except larger, much larger. The fold mouth measured 40 meters across. What came through it was not 40 meters across. It was larger than that. It came through in pieces, which was not division but the sequential arrival of a continuous entity whose total volume exceeded the fold's aperture, each piece connecting to the last as it crossed the threshold with a structural precision that made her think of ships being assembled in a dock, each section clicking into place against the previous one. The total process took 90 seconds, and when it was complete, the thing that stood on Deck 9 of the Vigil Unbroken was something that the station had not been built to contain. A sentient amalgam. She identified it from the Tenno's briefing, from the description of the war they had fought. The accumulation of 1,000 sentient bodies into a single distributed intelligence, everything that a sentient scout was, expanded by 3 orders of magnitude in mass, intellect, and adaptive capacity. It occupied the full volume of Deck 9, its geometric surfaces pressing against the bulkheads on every side, its presence alone causing the lighting systems to fail and the deck plating to develop stress fractures from the sheer incompatible mass of its being. It looked at the Tenno. The Tenno stood up. Dole watched through a pict feed that was already degrading, the camera sensors struggling with the interference the amalgam's presence generated. She watched the Tenno walk towards something that was 40 times their mass, with a blade that had been described by a universe's enemies as the most dangerous thing they had faced. And she watched the walk and she thought about all the times in her career that she had been in the presence of genuine courage, and how it never looked the way you expected, how it almost never announced itself, how it moved like this, unhurried, deliberate, not performing bravery for any audience but simply doing what came next. The amalgam struck first, a distributed pulse of energy that was the sentient equivalent of a contemptuous gesture, not its primary weapon, a test. The pulse hit the Warframe, and the Warframe went back 15 meters, hit the bulkhead, and the deck plating buckled, and the structural integrity alarm began to wail across every deck of the platform simultaneously. The Tenno was back up in 4 seconds. "That was good," the Tenno said, loudly enough to register on the degrading pict feed audio. "You're fast for something that needed a minute and a half to fit through a door." The amalgam's response was not verbal. It was physical, the full expression of its mass and adaptive intelligence brought to bear in a strike that moved with the speed of light, refracted through a prism made of ancient hatred. Every surface of the entity became a weapon simultaneously, the geometric precision of 1,000 sentient bodies working in unison, targeting the Warframe from 40 angles at once. What the Tenno did, then, was the thing that Magos Dole would spend the rest of her career attempting to model in mathematics and never fully capturing. They became transparent, not invisible, not displaced, transparent to the amalgam's attack in the way that glass is transparent to light, not because the attack missed, but because what it targeted was briefly not a solid thing. The Tenno passed through the attack the way a hand passes through flame when moved at the right speed, and they were inside the amalgam's reach before the strike completed, and the blade was moving, and the movement was not a single cut, but a sequence that seemed to exist in the gaps between moments, finding the seams of the amalgam's composition, the joints between the 1,000 sentient bodies that made up the whole, working at those joints not as physical weaknesses, but as conceptual ones. The amalgam adapted. Every cut that connected became a defense against the next cut, its distributed intelligence cycling through countermeasures at a rate that would have been impossible for any smaller processing architecture. The Umbra bled from a dozen points of contact. The armor cracked further, the golden light from the faceplate's wound, flickering, as the demands on the Tenno's void connection were pushed into ranges that registered on Dole's sensors as dangerous. But the Tenno did not use the same cut twice. This was the thing. Every stroke of the blade was new, not a different technique applied to the same target, but a genuinely novel application of force that the amalgam's adaptation system had no prior instance to learn from. The Tenno improvised at the speed of combat, creating new geometry of attack faster than the amalgam's thousand-mind intelligence could catalog and counter. It should not have been possible. Against an entity of that adaptive intelligence, improvisation should have been consumed as fast as it was generated, unless the improvisation came from somewhere the amalgam could not fully track. The void. The Tenno was pulling from the between, from the suture of the universe, drawing on the resonance of the sentient's own composition and inverting it, finding the frequencies at which each of the 1,000 component bodies resonated and applying a counter-frequency that was the void's equivalent of a tuning fork struck against a glass until the glass rings and shatters. Not a weapon deployed against a target, a voice speaking to something that had, buried under 1,000 accumulated battles, once been capable of listening. The amalgam shuddered. The first shudder, deep in its structure, propagated outward. Dole's sensors caught it. A cascade of resonance failure beginning at the points where the Tenno's blade had landed, spreading through the connection tissue between the component, sentient bodies. The amalgam recognized what was happening, because an intelligence of that scale cannot be unaware of its own dissolution, and what it did in response was the thing that made Dole's blood run cold. It drew on the between fold, which was still open behind it, still a wound in the geometry of local space, and pulled through it something that had been waiting on the other side. Not another sentient. Void energy itself, raw and unfiltered, the between pouring through the fold in a torrent that the platform was not built to contain. The Deck 9 superstructure began to collapse inward. The structural integrity alerts became catastrophic. 2 decks above, she felt the platform shudder with the particular violence of a vessel that is deciding whether it intends to remain in one piece. The Tenno was at the fold before she could track the movement on the pict feed. Standing at the aperture of the wound, between the amalgam and the torrent of raw between energy, the blade reversed in their grip and driven into the deck plating as an anchor, the other hand open toward the wound, and they did what she had seen them do to the scout, in Deck 5, in the beginning. They spoke, not in Gothic, not in any language that her audio systems could pass into phonemes or morphemes, the language of the between, pure resonance, the frequency of a consciousness that was native to the suture, speaking to the suture directly. She saw it on her sensors before she heard it, a wave of coherent void energy propagating from the Tenno's position outward in all directions, precisely tuned, finding the amalgam's composite resonance frequency and addressing it at every point simultaneously. The fold began to close. The amalgam fought it. Of course it fought it. It poured everything it had against the closing, drew every reserve of adapted power it had accumulated from the Tenno's own strikes, reversed them, and drove them back. The Tenno took those strikes without moving, took them in the chest, in the shoulders, in the cracked faceplate that was blazing gold now like a signal fire, like a lighthouse, like something burning in the center of a dark universe to tell the traveler that someone was home. Each strike hit, and the Tenno absorbed it and did not stop speaking, did not break the resonance, did not take a step back. The fold closed around the amalgam's connection to the between. Cut off from the raw energy source, the cascade of resonance failure that the blade had begun accelerated. Component sentient bodies began to separate, the 1,000-strong communion dissolving, the accumulated intelligence distributing back into its constituent parts, each one smaller and less coherent than the unified whole. The amalgam shrank, not surrendered, was not given the opportunity for surrender, was simply, by the mathematics of what the Tenno had done, no longer capable of cohering. One voice speaking to 1,000, in the language they had forgotten they shared. The sentience disaggregated. The light went out of them, the geometric precision softened and blurred, and they did not die so much as they ceased to maintain the specific configuration that made them a threat, scattering back into the void between, in fragments too small and too separated to pose a coherent danger. The platform was a wreck. Deck 9 was destroyed. The structural alarms were still wailing. Dole had 3 secondary systems down, and the primary sensor suite was operating on partial power. Rannox's stormtroopers were already moving through the cordon, weapons up, eyes wide, finding a deck that looked as though something geological had moved through it. In the center of the destruction, the Umbra stood, still upright. The armor was shattered across 3 major plates. The golden light from the faceplate crack had dimmed to barely a flicker. The blade was still driven into the deck plating, where it had been used as an anchor, and the Tenno did not move to retrieve it immediately. Rannox came through the cordon himself. He stopped 10 meters from the Warframe and looked at the scale of the devastation, and looked at the entity standing in the middle of it, and he was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Are you going to be all right?" It was not the question Dole expected from him. It was not the question the inquisitorial rosette typically generated. The Tenno looked at him. The glow in the cracked faceplate pulsed once, twice, steadied. "Define all right," the Tenno said. "Can you stand?" "I'm standing." "Can you fight?" "If I have to, I'd rather not, for a while." Rannox nodded, slowly, with the manner of a man revising a document he had spent a long time writing. "The bleed, the fold. Is it closed?" "Both of them. All residual harmonics dissolved when the amalgam disaggregated. The seam around this platform has gone quiet." The Tenno paused. "For now." Quillin Varish appeared beside Rannox, as if she had always been there, which she possibly had. "The skein forward from this moment shows 20 possible futures," she said pleasantly, looking at nothing in particular. "In 17 of them, the Tenno is still on this platform in 6 months." She paused. "In 3 of them, something much larger than an amalgam follows the resonance trail in approximately 40 days. Rannox looked at her. She smiled, which was visible in the slight change to the angle of her mask. The voice has spoken. The universe heard it. The question that was always going to arise after the first words were spoken has arisen. She turned to the Tenno. "You cannot stop speaking. You have spoken. The Between knows you are here. The Sentients know you are here. The only direction is forward." She tilted her head. "Fortunately, forward is the only direction the story goes." Rannox turned to the Tenno for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes that was not the clipped theological certainty of the Ordo Xenos' standard operational posture. Something older and more considered. "I am going to send a report to my superiors," he said, "that is going to be extremely carefully worded. It is going to describe a contained anomaly, successfully neutralized, with a recommendation for ongoing study of an extra-dimensional phenomenon of potential strategic significance." He paused. "It is not going to describe you in any specific way that would trigger a purge order." The Tenno was quiet. "Why?" "Because I have spent 30 years deciding what the Imperium needs and what the Imperium fears, and occasionally discovering they are the same thing," he said. "The Imperium needs something that can close those wounds. Whatever you are, and whatever you did to become it, that is what I watched happen just now. A wound closed. I am not going to be the man who purges the only entity in this galaxy that can close void wounds at source, because it did not arrive with the correct paperwork." He looked at Dole. "Continue your study, within reason. Anything you find that can be extracted and replicated, I want it documented and transmitted to the Ordo immediately." He looked at Varesh. "You, I want watched at all times." "You are welcome to try," she said warmly. He looked back at the Tenno, and something passed between the Inquisitor and the Warframe that was not words, was not hierarchy, was not the machinery of civilization managing an anomaly. It was 2 people who had both been shaped into something by things that did not ask their permission, recognizing each other. 40 days, Rannox said. "If the Shadowseer's timeline holds, I'm going to use 40 days to acquire reinforcements." He paused. "Can you teach them?" "Teach them what?" "What you did, what the void sounds like, how to hear the harmonics in the geometry before the fold opens." He stopped. "Not to do what you do. I am not suggesting we try to replicate you. I am asking if you can teach people to listen the way you listen." The Tenno thought about this for a long time, long enough that Dole found herself thinking of all the things she had learned to hear in her years as a Magos. The frequencies of metal under stress, the harmonics of a cogitator about to fail, the specific resonance of a memory engram cycling through its stored content in the deep hours of station night. All the things the universe spoke in, that she had learned to hear one instrument at a time. "Yes," the Tenno said. "I think I can teach people to listen." The blade came free of the deck plating with a sound like a question being answered. The Tenno held it. The glow in the faceplate's crack was steady now, not blazing, steady. The kind of light that does not announce itself, but does not go out. Dole looked at the destroyed deck, at the residual geometry of closed wounds and disaggregated sentience, at the sensor data still streaming to her arrays, and she thought, this is what the Omnissiah's data looks like when it arrives unasked for. This is what the universe teaches when it does not warn you first. She archived everything. Every reading, every frame of pict feed, every audio log and sensor trace, and the geometric notation she had developed in 11 months of studying the between harmonics, all of it filed under a classification she created on the spot, sealed to her authority alone. She named the file Mirror, not for a designation, for a memory that had refused to be replaced, for the thing that knew what was worth protecting. In the weeks that followed, in the scarred and rebuilt spaces of the Vigil Unbroken, 3 things occurred that had never occurred before in the long and extraordinarily eventful history of the Coronis Expanse. A Magos explorator and a Tenno sat together for 16 hours a day and built, in precise and loving mathematical detail, a model of a dimension that neither their civilizations had ever successfully mapped. An inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos composed the most carefully worded report in his 30-year career and filed it and waited for the chain to respond and prepared for both outcomes with equal professionalism. And a Harlequin Shadowseer sat in a chair that no one had given her and watched the data accumulate and the conversations evolve and the lessons move from 1 mind to 3 to 7 as Rannox's reinforcements began to arrive and the Tenno began to teach listening to a galaxy that had been screaming too loudly to hear the suture of itself for 10,000 years, and she felt, in the way that Harlequins feel things, which is with the serenity of those who have already read to the last page, something that she would not have predicted from the skein. She felt hope. Not the abstract hope of prophecy fulfilled, but the specific and contingent hope that lives between people when the conditions that produced catastrophe have been slightly, stubbornly, at enormous cost, changed. The between-fold resonances remained quiet. 38 days, 39. On the morning of the 40th day, Dole's sensors showed a faint harmonic in the geometric substructure of local space, the first note of a frequency she had learned to read, the way she had learned to read everything else worth knowing, with patience and with grief, and with the willingness to begin again. The Tenno sat in the center of Deck 5, rebuilt and reinforced, and breathed, which was not breathing, which was what the void did when a native spoke to it, and the universe listened. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, a child had once been put inside a weapon and told that the weapon was necessary and the child was the cost. 10,000 years earlier, on a throne of gold, a father had been put inside an empire and told the same. The scales of that transaction had been debated in the philosophy chambers of 100 generations, argued in the blood of 1 trillion soldiers, weighed in the silence of those who survived long enough to understand what they had been asked to pay. But here, in the Coronis Expanse, above a gas giant that did not care about any of it, a weapon had arrived that remembered being a child, and had taught a universe of weapons to listen for the silence between their own strikes. Whether that listening would be enough, whether the suture would hold, whether the 40 days would become 400, and the 400 would become 4,000, and the long war against the dark would find in the between voice something it had not possessed before, a frequency against which extinction could not adapt, remained the province of Farseers and Inquisitors, and the dreaming Emperor on his golden engine of sacrifice. But the Tenno stood in the rebuilt deck of the Vigil Unbroken, and the blade was in their hand, and the void spoke when they asked it to, and for the first time since the Zariman had crossed the void and returned carrying children who were no longer only children, what the Tenno carried,